Hi, I'm Jason Gorber from ThatShelf.com, and we're here to expand the world of Tolkien with Peter Jackson's film series, The Hobbit.
Big shelf.
Now, after the grand success of the Lord of the Rings series, the 3 films that were sort of supposed to be 2 and then expanded into 3, we had time for that success to sort of bake in. Look, the Return of the King won Best Picture. People were very excited about this, and everybody thought, well, what are we going to do about the so-called prequel book that was written primarily for Tolkien's kids? Now, the fact of the matter is that the way that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings connected was always sort of strangely tangential, and a lot of that sort of expanded as the writings expanded. Now, through very complicated things that sort of get into how Tolkien's estate and all that nonsense plays out, the fact of the matter is that the rights for The Hobbit and the rights for The Lord of the Rings were the entirety of what Peter Jackson had access to. He had no access to the other tales, the unfinished tales, the Silmarillion, any of that stuff were actually outside the scope of the rights that he actually had access to. And so some of the sort of expansion of what primarily is, again, the most childish of the books in this series, written for Tolkien's kids, allowed him to go into those elements in The Lord of the Rings that had not been explored, the appendices. That stuff when you finally get to the end of the 3rd book and think, oh, there's a heck of a lot more here, such as the lives of the dwarves. This is the sort of real, like, nitty-gritty, getting into the deep end stuff that Tolkien fans and fans of the greater Lord of the Rings world really get excited about. And it's clear that everything about The Hobbit really was meant to be a passion project. Originally, Peter Jackson was going to step back and allow Guillermo del Toro to actually take the reins. Del Toro had these inclinations to sort of create an entire different visual look. It was going to rely much more upon practical effects than it was the computer effects, the groundbreaking character effects that were done in the first Lord of the Rings films. That's to take nothing away the fact that Weta made extraordinary costumes and makeup effects, and again, the bigatures that we talked about last video, but nonetheless, with a different vision and perhaps even a slightly starker vision, Guillermo del Toro's efforts were going to sort of play out. Now, through lots of other machinations between who owns what studio, all of the bankruptcy, all this craziness, it ended up that the Del Toro project sort of faltered. He couldn't wait any longer after spending, I believe, years in New Zealand actually developing it. And he went off to make another passion project, as he often tends to do. If he doesn't have one thing, he's got 100 other things that he could be doing. But in this case, it was Pacific Rim, which was his sort of kaiju large-scale epic, which again, is a great film, and also has a beautiful combination between practical and computer effects. Nonetheless, we're sort of left with this Hobbit film. It's going to be made. What are they going to do with it? And it was decided to do 2 films. Again, they were going to do sort of split it into 2 and sort of take it that way. And again, if the stories are to believe, somewhere between the studio and the way that the stories were, that if Lord of the Rings was designed to be 2 films originally, and then Peter Jackson sort of pushed for it to be 3, this very much was New Line, Warner's, and the other studio people saying, hey, let's do another trilogy. It sort of works better that way, which meant that you were expanding this relatively small story of this is a hobbit, this is what he does, he goes, he wanders off, goes see a dragon with his dwarven friends, meets some elves along the way, and really incorporated a bunch of the greatest hits of The Lord of the Rings appendices into this. You also got several characters that were sort of given relative short shrift in The Lord of the Rings. Some of the more mythical characters, the other wizards, Radagast is a good example. You have Bjorn, the bear creature, that sort of hinted at all these other mythical creatures that played a greater role within the pantheon and the general myth structure that Tolkien developed. Now, I'm no Stephen Colbert, I'm no particular expert on the Maya and all this other nonsense, but nonetheless what you get out of The Hobbit is the expansion of this, is this telling of what's fundamentally, again, the Beowulf story. A warrior goes, a dragon's there, they find a weak spot, they know how to actually destroy the dragon. This is an ancient story that, again, back to Beowulf, Tolkien himself was one of the first, if not the first, Old English scholars to actually declare that Beowulf was, in fact, not Norse or some other quote-unquote foreign story, but something that served as essentially the beginnings of Old English myth-making. Somewhere between Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf, you have the beginnings of this type of sort of indigenous narrative storytelling on the British Isles that obviously somebody like Tolkien was fascinated by, about how it took these elements from Norse, from other places in Scandinavia, from Germanic myths, from other Eastern European myths, and sort of coalesced into a new form of narrative storytelling, which he very much hoped that his narratives would actually play out. So The Hobbit comes out, and it does a couple things that frankly really pissed off a lot of people. One, it was shot in 3D, which at the time a lot of people had fallen in love with Avatar, but had soured, especially because of a bunch of post-converts that people were not happy with. Now, we could go on and on and on about this, but the issue wasn't the post-convert. The issue was a shitty post-convert. Clash of the Titans being the sort of big punching bag. It was given like 5 weeks and done after the fact. The fact is that certain films like Avatar use a tremendous amount of post-convert. Heck, even The Hobbit used a bunch of post-convert, even though it was shot with 3D systems, in order to actually get the Z-axis and all those elements sort of right. Nonetheless, that's an argument for a whole nother day. I will simply say that those that didn't love this film in 3D were primarily seeing it in pretty poor 3D projection. Those that had the opportunity to see it, as I did, with a laser projected IMAX, it was an extraordinary experience, as was the use of high frame rate. Now, this was a very controversial thing at the time. He shot at 48 frames per second, using at the time experimental red cameras, which gives a sense of both reality and surrealism for those of us who are birthed on 24 frame a second footage. Now, it definitely gives it a look that is free from motion blur. And I will say one very frustrating part of the use of high frame rate on the theatrical experience, especially for the first film, was that Peter Jackson was using many of his old techniques that he used an indie filmmaker back when he was shooting on 16, which is his trademark whip pan. Now, if you do whip pans and there's no motion blur, the thing looks very, very strange. I will say anybody who had the experience of seeing it just once probably found the whole thing off-putting and just wanted to write the entire exercise off and just wanted the movies just presented the way that we're actually used to seeing them. I've said before, and I said at the time, that one of the keys to high frame rate, as crazy as it is to actually see the film very soon after you've just seen it. And everything will actually sort of coalesce into place. I've described it being like anybody who has glasses. You go to your eye doctor and you put in your new prescription, and you think your eye doctor is insane. I can't see anything. Everything looks weird and distorted. And then when you wake up and your brain has adjusted to the new way of going, it works. The fact of the matter is our brains are accustomed to the trickery of 24 frames a second. We simply accept the judder, the motion blur, all these elements, the sort of artificiality of that type of frame movement that we've simply come to accept. We've taught ourselves how to see 24 frames a second since we first saw our first theatrical experience. And the fact of the matter is that many people who are coming up in the video game world actually see that smearing and all that stuff and want to get rid of it. It's a very weird thing about what counts as cinematic. Fact of the matter is, with high frame rate and with 3D, especially by the absence of all the artificial blurring that you would get from lower frame rate, you had a truly immersive film. And frankly, by the time you got to the second and third Hobbit films, he had not only changed the way the actual shutter angle to actually allow for a certain amount of positive motion blur, but actually tweaked the color and other elements of the film, especially in action moments, to actually balance out that crystal clear element that you get with HFR and those moments that you actually get with 3D. So by the time you got the third film in The Hobbit, by the time that even the press screenings were taking place in 2D, non-high frame rate, there were some fantastic things that the audience was simply not stomaching. They had already made up their mind. Now, what did we have? We had these two elements, 3D and high frame rate, both of them very divisive. For me, the 3D really did work quite well in the way that, especially in high frame rate. But at home, there was a real pleasure that we could actually have to actually experience these films in 2D or 3D, whichever way you actually want to do it. The original home video releases were available in 3D back when televisions were actually being allowed. Now, again, for those of you who are fans of 3D, you know that on Blu-ray, the format was actually expanded to allow for 3D Blu-ray. So this is 1080, but 3D, twin 1080. And on my previous television set, my beloved 65E6P, I could play these at home using Real D technology, and it was fantastic. It wasn't quite as, obviously, it wasn't anywhere near as immersive and incredible as seeing it in laser high frame rate 3D, but nonetheless, it's a very, very good way of actually seeing it. And if you were to see it with this color timing and all those elements at home, this was very much a very positive way to go. Now, what have they done? They have released, just like Lord of the Rings, the box set of all the Hobbit films, both theatrical and extended, on 4K. Now, I didn't mention this in Lord of the Rings. These are actually, I believe, the first set I've ever got. There are only 4K discs. There's no Blu-rays in here. They didn't even bother, which, you know, I kind of like. We also know that there's this other expanded set that Warner Home Video has already announced is coming out. And that will include everything that's in this disc, everything in the other box, and certain select additional elements. And presumably the commentaries that are available on the original discs and the original Lord of the Rings discs. Which means the original appendices, those hours and hours and hours and hours of stuff, which is frankly fantastic if you're really a fan of these films, you have to keep your Blu-ray sets for that. So that is just a heads up. Do not get rid of anything yet in anticipation. Now, for those of you wondering, should you go out and buy these? I mean, frankly, this looks stunning in 4K. It's beautiful. The Lord of the Rings color timing was changed quite a bit for Blu-ray. I didn't really get into this last video. I want to bring it up here. Lord of the Rings color timing had been changed really radically when they actually did the Blu-ray release. It was much darker and a very sort of almost a color tinted stylistic choice. Now, I don't mind when you give these kind of choices as long as we have some sort of way of having the more theatrical experience. And frankly, not because of HFR, high frame rate, but high dynamic range, the ability of 4K to have many more colors evident, the gradations evident, all those elements, and better color timing, and going back to the original camera negative and all those fun things, you could get Lord of the Rings looking just brilliant. Almost at home, almost as good as the best theatrical presentation you're ever going to get. With Hobbit, you're never going to get that. You are never going to get high frame rate 3D laser projection on IMAX screen at home. Nowhere close. I don't care what you do and what your setup is, we're simply not getting it. And one sort of minor frustration, for me a little bit of a major frustration, is 4K doesn't allow you to do 3D, which is super irritating. It's just not part of the format specifications, and frankly, no modern television does 3D. Projectors do, but there's a whole nother conversation. But what 4K can do is high frame rate, and the Ang Lee films that are coming out actually do this. They actually have, in their case, the 4K version in high frame rate and the regular frame rate version on 1080 Blu-ray. Now, again, what would I like? A disc of both. Give me 4K non-high frame rate, give me 4K high frame rate, and I'd be happy. Again, who knows what they're going to do for this big box set? Maybe that'd be one extra they throw in for crazy people like me, to actually have the 48 frame a second 2D versions as part of the set. It would also be amazing if they included the 3D Blu-rays, since they're including Blu-rays on that, just so you could have one sort of big definitive set. I'd actually thoroughly enjoy that. I may be a minority on that, but nonetheless, here we are. Now, that's all the technical stuff. How does The Hobbit look? It looks damn good. And what happens when you actually take that high frame rate footage and sort of downgrade it to essentially 24p playback? You actually get some of the advantages of how it was filmed. It has a little, the blurring is less. You have a greater clarity. The way that the actual world sort of allows you to fall into it is still there. It's not quite as unsettling for those who are not used to that format. It certainly feels, for lack of a better word, cinematic. I mean, it's a whole way of breaking it down. But nonetheless, this feels quote unquote more normal, yet the clarity is extraordinary. Because it was shot on digital, you have the ability to actually go into those raw files and create discs that look tremendous. Now, I miss out on 3D. We've gone through that. But if we're going to do the best version on 2D, non-frame rate, without question, it's the 4K version. Which brings us to the films themselves. And I'm here to defend the Hobbit films. Yes, I am. I don't pretend that they are as good as the Lord of the Rings saga, and people have all kinds of problems with Lord of the Rings saga. But nonetheless, I think what you have here is truly a love letter to all of these elements. And it was done under a lot of, headaches, and they didn't necessarily have all the elements together that they wanted, and they were rushed on some stuff. It may not be perfect, but they exist, and I'm kind of happy that they exist. There are moments that really do shine. Nothing quite to the same level, the same sense of majesty and wonder that you had with what came before, but that's inevitable. The fact of the matter is, I do not begrudge these Hobbit films. And so many people do. Yes, the battles go on probably longer than they needed to, especially ironic since fundamentally this was a film that was against battles. We actually see visualized many moments in The Hobbit that were glossed over in the book. The end battle in the book is completely glossed over because what Tolkien was worried about was the quote-unquote human ramifications, not the actual battle itself. Clearly, when you have something that's cinematic, it allows you to expand and see stuff visually you wouldn't normally see when you have a whole bunch of orcs and dwarves and all this stuff fighting. It's still a lot of fun. There are moments where you get that sort of old school Peter Jackson, people's heads being chopped off, and it ends up being entertaining, certainly. But so much of what takes place really comes down to the sort of the core troupe as they go along. And I think they did a fantastic job in casting. I think Freeman does a remarkable job. And I fundamentally see it as simply an addition to something that I love. It feels sort of like those appendices when you read Lord of the Rings. Stuff that sort of bonuses adds up the level to what came before. It's like the most expensive supplementary material ever made. And I think so many people went in with weird expectations. They forgot some of the clunkiness of Lord of the Rings. And they also didn't necessarily love the fact that there was stuff that had been left out that was added back in. Stuff like the singing, for example. Or again, some of these secondary characters that frankly are goofy. People forget in the sort of somber, mythic grandeur of the Lord of the Rings that so much of Tolkien is genuinely silly because it's drawn from not only old stories, but I think he had this sort of weird sort of cheesiness that he actually embraced oftentimes. He could absolutely go to the heights of creating basically a sort of virtual religion on the one hand. On the other hand, he just liked silly things. He liked the thought of a bunch of dwarves sitting and having a food fight, that sort of thing. So The Hobbit for me plays very well as something that is an addition to the sort of core thing. It certainly doesn't supplant what came before, and like so many other prequels and sequels and all kinds of things that we live with in other films that we love so very much, it does nothing to take away from Lord of the Rings and does quite a bit to add to it. It gives you a different sort of veneer on what you've already seen before. Everybody from Bilbo and Frodo, as they bookend to this, to how Gandalf behaves, to all the performers that come back, the Gollum performance, some of those elements sort of add puzzle pieces into what came before. Is it necessary? Absolutely not. We would have been totally fine if it was just Lord of the Rings. Is it simply cash-in? Absolutely not. I think that they did a really good job with what they were working with. I think that its expansion, sure, it's a little bit bloated. Sure, it has some elements. It's certainly not perfect. But the weird sort of derision of it, I think, overplays what Lord of the Rings does and underplays what The Hobbit is. I think that tonally, what you got by Peter Jackson doing these 3 films, creating this sort of 6-film trilogy, really 2 trilogies, one a major trilogy, the other one a commentary almost on the earlier, is you get something that feels very much part of the whole. When you get somebody like a Smaug, voiced by Benedict Cumberbatch, sort of writ large, anybody who started with the Hobbits and then moved on to Lord of the Rings gets a thrill. There's some really terrific moments, particularly with the dragons, with the interaction, with the whole notion of the dwarves and greed. Again, I talked in Lord of the Rings how much I thoroughly enjoyed the sort of opening 10-minute sequences that sort of give you the backstory. There's a little bit of that in here as well, but nonetheless, it's so much of it is, again, sort of digging down like the dwarves do, finding new things to explore, new jewels to actually admire. Is it as fulfilling as the first trilogy? Of course not, but does it work as a standalone project? I absolutely think it does. Now, as I said, we didn't get everything we wanted. We don't have all the supplementary materials. Much of that will come later rather. We do not have what I would want, the high frame rate in the 3D versions. I don't know if that'll ever come out, frankly, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we have here a fantastic demo-worthy projection of these Hobbit films. And if you sit back and sort of just accept the things that are a little bit clunky and simply embrace the storytelling, embrace it as yet another extension, yet another journey with some characters, or at least a world, journey into a world that we sort of come to be very fond of. I think you'll get a lot more of The Hobbit this time around than maybe you did when you saw it in the theaters and had all these weird pent-up expectations about it. That's what I say for any of these films that come, that are these kind of sort of blockbustery stuff, especially if you have a strong emotional connection to it. It's always better to watch them and rewatch them and rewatch them, because what happens is not just, yes, this sense of hypnotism that you're simply, inculcating yourself in the project, but it's something I believe very fundamental, is that we simply accept the sort of quirks and, clunky bits of the things that we love and overlook them and embrace the things in those projects that we simply are drawn to. I think that with The Hobbit, we go in with such heightened expectations that it wasn't allowed to sort of breathe as what it was. If you see it in a home environment without as much baggage, without as much sort of pent-up expectation, and simply see how it flows beautifully into what came before in the Lord of the Rings films, I think you'll have a much better job watching them. And the 4K from Warner is simply breathtaking. It looks so damn good. Between the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, you have hours and hours and hours of epic filmmaking to enjoy. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe. Please follow us on social media. Really means a lot that you guys are embracing our videos of these epic lengths. Let us know in the comments what you think. Hopefully the camera did a little bit better job this time. We'll see how it all works, and we'll see you next time. All the best. Take care.